Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Next Level Engagement, the Power of Clustering-Based Content Recommendations. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping details. Today's webinar is being recorded and an online archive of today's event will be available a few days after the session. If you have trouble seeing the slides at any time during the presentation, please press F5 to refresh your screen on a PC or Command R if you're using a Mac. You may ask a question at any time during the presentation by typing your question into the Q&A box located on the right side of your screen and pressing Enter. And finally, I'd like to remind you of AHIP's antitrust statement located in the link just below the slide viewer. We will, as always, comply with that statement. Among other things, the antitrust statement prohibits us from discussing competitively sensitive information. We're very fortunate to have with us today Drs. Catherine Bass and Erica Zur. Dr. Bass serves as the Senior Director of Informatics and Innovation at Onlife Health. She holds a PhD in Health and Human Performance with an emphasis in health promotion and has 20 years of experience in the health and wellness industry, including a national award from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention for innovations in healthy behavior data collection. Dr. Zur is the Director of Advanced Analytics at Onlife Health. Her responsibilities include using artificial intelligence techniques to drive the personalization experience for Onlife members and enhance the dynamic nature of the portal and find ways to improve operational efficiencies using machine learning models. At this time, I would like to turn the floor over to our speakers. Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for being here with us today. We look forward to presenting this information and also look forward to interaction with you guys. And if you've got questions, you heard in the little question and answer section, and we'll try to keep an eye on them throughout the presentation so that if we can pepper them into our conversation, we will do that as well. So I'll get us started here today. So we are going to be talking about engagement, and particularly how we leverage data to increase engagement in our portal application. And I wanted to do a quick little reference point for you and go over what our experience looks like so you can have a kind of a mental image to figure out where we're talking about these things. So if you see these images on the right, this is what our experience looks like, just in different formats, you know, mobile application versus iPad versus the web portal. And in the bottom of the screen, especially if you look at the iPad version, there's a couple little squares with purple bars underneath them. That's an area that we call our Explore section. And it's where we put content and resources and programming links for our members to consume in addition to the things that we're doing from a clinical standpoint. And that's the section that we're updating with the things that you're going to hear us talk about with the models that Erica's team has created. And so we can do a lot of different personalization efforts here, and that is what we feel is really important from an engagement standpoint, is thinking about how can you make the information, the resources that you're promoting to people relevant and personalized. And so we're leveraging data to do that, but we also have on the left side of the screen some things that you can see about how we're kind of taking all of those inputs and doing, you know, the work that we do, the sort of data science magic that Erica's team does, and put those things together for whether line of business, so, you know, whether we're talking about a commercial group, the Medicare Advantage group, the individual business, we can take into account members' actions and preferences. So the way in which they behaved in our system, we can collect that data and then kind of work that into our models to further sophisticate them, or to make them more sophisticated. It's terrible grammar, sorry. To make them more sophisticated so that they are more accurate. The more information we have, the more accurate. Also, member preferences, you know, is something you can get explicit pieces of data and kind of include that as well. And then we're always thinking about how we can make sure we're understanding what the priorities are for our clients who are typically health plans, and then the groups that those health plans serve. You know, so understanding those priorities so we can make sure that we're modeling things appropriately with the right outcomes, you know, to push to the members. We're leveraging personas, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. That'll be a deep dive for us, and including quite a bit of the content on social determinants of health. So in the next, I'm going to do a very quick level set on and I'm going to refer to it as SDoH because it's just easier to say than social determinants of health. So I'm going to do a little deep dive on that so that we can just do a quick level set so we're all on the same page before we get into this. And I think the other things think about here are incentives. And again, anything that we're working on, like gaps in care, that is important to the client, particularly by line of business, as well as the member interactions that we want to take into account. And we're thinking about the ways in which we take this data and make it personalized. So I'm going to run over here to the next slide to talk a little bit about, very quickly, social determinants of health. I just want to make sure everybody's kind of, looking at looking at this from the same perspective. Social determinants of health are very prevalent right now in a lot of health plan strategies and employer group strategies. I think it's important to think about these things if we really want to make meaningful change in members and drive that. So very quickly, because there's a couple of different definitions if you're thinking about SDoH, but we use the one that is published by the CDC, and so that's the definition that you see over there on the left. And basically, it's everything in a person's environment, from their ability to get to access to care, to graduation rates and education kind of components, safety of your neighborhood, built environments, all the things that are in that person's environment that can affect their ability to or likelihood to make a healthy choice. So it's not just about education and awareness, and especially if you come from the health promotion background, a lot of what we think about, kind of on the first pass at things is educating somebody, which is an important component, but that only goes so far. If you talk to somebody about the importance of being adherent with your medications, for example, but they don't have public transportation or a car, and they can't get to their doctor's office for check-ins to get refills or pick up their medications on time from the pharmacy, it's not just about them knowing that that's an important thing. They don't have the resources to take action on that. And so understanding that's an important piece of, if we think about how we really want to affect people and be helping them thrive, we've got to think about things just beyond education and awareness. The squares to the kind of middle and right of the slide are the different domains, which are and and then social and community context. So I think one of the things with social and community context that's interesting is that it's thinking about all those things related to how you're connected to your neighborhood, your community, your involvement with your cliques. It may be that you belong to a church. It may be that you belong to a softball league, those kinds of things. So kind of being invested in your community is a big piece of this. And we're going to talk about those as social associations. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on the models, the persona models that we're checking in. So I put a mental mark to chat about here. Why it's important to focus on social determinants of health. I've talked about this a little bit already, but I think it's interesting when you actually see this show up in research. I think if we can understand things intuitively, that's not the same thing as being able to prove it.
So we really wanted to leverage social determinants of health data for all the reasons I was saying. I think it's really important if we're going to truly impact members' behavior and their quality of life. Can't just be thinking about, telling them how to do things. So in order to do that, we had a very broad kind of business problem. We'd like to apply this data. And there are really two ways in which we were thinking about doing that. You heard me talk a little bit about how important it is for us to think about what the priorities and goals are for our health plan clients and their employer groups. And that's a big piece of what we want to focus on. So you see in the left, we're talking about health plan throughputs. You've got things like health plans initiatives. They may have strategic partnerships or pilots that they're doing, and that gives us an opportunity to leverage that data and take into account the things that they're working on and support them in that way. But we also wanted to bring something to our member experience that really also helped us think about that data and how we can have a more personalized and relevant experience for the members. And so that's what you see on the right here when we're talking about intelligent recommendations. And again, those recommendations are really showing up for those members in this bottom section that's the Explore that you see with the purple kind of lines underneath it. We're going to look at that in a little bit bigger view here in a few minutes. But just to kind of keep up with where these things are kind of showing up in the member's experience. So we took this broad goal of applying SDoH data, and I went to Erica and her team and said, hey, this is what we'd like to do. Can you work on how this would look? And it was really, she did a great job of taking a very broad statement of we want to use SDoH data and actually worked out a way to apply this in a great way for us to put this in front of the members. So Erica, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about how you took this business problem and really turned it into a data science problem that y'all could work through on models. So let me turn it over to you for a few minutes.
All right, thank you. So as Catherine said, we needed to frame this business problem as a data science problem in order to really fully leverage the value of the data. So that data science problem statement was to create data-driven groups or clusters of U.S. Census tracts based on this SDoH data. And that would then allow us to, personalize content by a member census tract, and also by the multiple variables that we understand impact SDoH in that census tract. So in order to do that, we use an unsupervised machine learning algorithm called k-means clustering. It's one of a class of general clustering algorithms that is used for grouping data together. So after a lot of data cleaning and pre-processing, you pass data through this algorithm, and you tell it how many groups you would like, and the result is these natural data-driven groupings or clusters of the data. And then once those are fully analyzed and we kind of understand them from a market perspective, we call those personas. So we'll use the terms clusters and personas somewhat interchangeably throughout, just kind of a heads up there. So each data point or census tract would be assigned to one cluster or persona, and then the clusters are described by the average values of all of the data points that belong to them. So we kind of understand the characteristic values of those clusters or of those personas. So on the next slide, you will see the data points that we use to run through this clustering algorithm. It came from a couple different publicly available data sources. The first one is the U.S. Census American Community Survey, and then we also use data from the CDC Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, and I always have to say that very slowly because it is such a tongue twister. We call it the BRFSS, and we pulled that BRFSS data through a secondary data source called the County Health Rankings. So these were the data points. I won't read them all out to you, but you can see them listed on the slide to give you an idea of the kinds of variables we're working with. That's what we ran through our clustering algorithm, and that gives us our SDoH personas, which are on the next slide, and Catherine's going to tell you a little bit more about.
Yeah, so as you heard Erica say, we're taking the results of her models, which are clusters, but we turn those into personas as something that's a workable, item for us to leverage in our member experience. And the way we do that is we're looking at two different things. Their average characteristics. So you kind of heard her talking about, you can look at the characteristics for these naturally occurring groups. And that's what you'll see kind of in these bullet points in the middle of this slide here. And then we looked at those characteristics and tried to capture the essence of who they were and named them. So you're seeing, all the way on the left, you see urban diversity, and then all the way on the right, you see Uptown Urbanites and just a couple things in between to really capture the essence of what the people who would fall into that cluster, who they are, what you might understand about them from a demographic standpoint, from where they live, things that might be that resonate with them, or just characteristics about their people. And then beneath that, we have engagement and insight. So we were able to go back, and once we knew where everybody fell in the personas, we could go back and look and see, okay, everybody that was in the rural connections, how did they actually behave in our system and engage with us? And so we're able to understand a little bit about their average characteristics from the data, and then we're able to understand about how they may behave, what they're likely to do, not likely to do, enjoy, not enjoy, by understanding how they've already worked with us. And that gives us a lot of actionable information. It gives us some information that we feed back to our plans, because they often don't have this level of data, like with health assessment information, because that's something that they're usually getting from their vendor. And that's another area of comprehensive data collection that we can pass over to them, and some value-added insights. But then we're really leveraging the engagement insights to understand how we can better engage these people, the things that they might be interested in, the content that we might push to them, that kind of thing. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about. So when we really started thinking about how do we use SDoH data to provide these intelligent recommendations, we took this process that you hear Erica going through, doing the modeling, and then working through what that looks like is turning it into personas. And then we went through with our content team, and I'm going to go onto our next slide here. We went through with our content team what social determinants of health mean. This is what this means. This is what the definitions are. These are the kind of metrics. We went through the whole process. We went through a little bit of what we've talked about today so far, kind of the modeling, the results of those models with the clusters and the personas, and then talked with them about what each one of those personas meant, so that we could understand what information we currently had. We have a content vendor, so we did a survey of the information we have available to us there, and we're able to understand which things would fit as far as appropriate content to push to these different personas. But we also did a gap analysis to understand where we had information and where we had some areas where we may have lacked a little bit and needed to do some fleshing out of that. So we worked with our content team to kind of go over this, do a little mini deep dive on what social determinants of health mean and what it means for us as a wellness partner, and then work to have them create and kind of fill in those gaps of what content we needed to have to push to them. Because the important thing to think here is, you often hear the term that data is king, and obviously we are data people, so I fully support that. But data is really king when you use the data in an actionable way. So it's not just about having the data, it's about taking that data and really putting context around it so that you have information. Data on its own is numerical values. When you put a story around it, when you frame it up, when you think about the decisions that you're going to make with this or the actions you want to take on that data, that's really when it becomes king. So that's an important piece to remember there. So we worked with our content team, and we got a variety of content curated and tagged it appropriately. And when I say that, let me stop for just a minute and say something about that. When I say we tagged it appropriately, we identified content that would be appropriate for the various personas. So when I was talking about, for example, the Uptown Urbanites, this is a group that is likely living probably in a rather urban area. It's what I refer to as mixed use, meaning there might be retail or shops in the first floor levels, but there may be condos and living area, apartments ahead of that in the same kind of buildings. I often think about a lot of New York neighborhoods. That feels like the way those are kind of structured. There's a lot of that. We're located in Nashville. There's a lot of that kind of growth in the Nashville area, that mixed use kind of area. And that's really who I think of these people are. They tend to have a bit of a higher education level on average. Their income tends to be a little bit higher, but also they have lower levels of social association. So if you recall what I was saying a little earlier when we were talking about the different domains that are summarized under social determinants of health, one of those is that social cohesion. And the civic, that was where we were talking about civic participation. Maybe you're on a softball league, maybe you belong to a church, you're connected with your neighborhood. And so there's a lot of research that associates and correlates high social association. So how connected you feel with your neighbors, your community, how engaged you are. And that is correlated with better health outcomes. And the other side of that coin is that if you have low social associations, you have that's correlated with negative health outcomes. And I think the important thing to point out here, something that we felt was interesting, is, as you can imagine intuitively, social determinants of health are very much driven by socioeconomic status. So if you've got people who maybe are depressed financially, who don't have a lot of resources at their disposal, that is oftentimes some pretty major characteristics of their environment that inhibit their ability to make those healthy choices. And so we often think about people who maybe have more resources available to them, like the Uptown Urbanites, who have a higher level of education on average, who have higher average income levels, as not being susceptible to these vulnerabilities. But there is still something to look for in this population, and that's the fact that they have lower levels of social associations. Maybe that's, of course, with the pandemic, that makes a lot of sense that we're all kind of a little bit more isolated. But these were done pre-pandemic. These models were done pre-pandemic. And I do think that, you've got some of these people who may be, maybe more focused on their career, and maybe they're tech driven, and maybe they worked remotely previously, and they don't have as many social associations. And I think that's a big thing for us to think about, is that there's always something that's a vulnerability in all these populations, and that's what you need to focus on so that you can address it. So what we did is kind of worked through, like, what would be the appropriate content for Uptown Urbanites, especially if you're going to think about, how different they may be from the rural connections people. You don't necessarily want to always promote the same content, because things are not going to resonate with people in the rural connections in the same way that they would with Uptown Urbanites and vice versa. So that's really what I want to skip over to here, is how this actually starts influencing what the members see. So what you'll see here is sort of a zoomed in view of what we've been looking at a little bit further pace back, but you can kind of see now that it's actually a tile with a description and a little title where they can click out and go look at this article. And it's important, I think, in this day and age of a divided attention span and a lot of other consumer engagement industries like Netflix and Amazon and Pinterest, who are doing these, incredible jobs of highly relevant personalized information. It's important for us to frame things up in a way that will capture somebody's attention. So we've only got somebody's attention for a very short period of time. You need to capitalize on that. When you've got that opportunity, someone's looking at your stuff, you want to leverage that as much as possible and put something in front of them that would resonate with them so that you can keep them coming back to your content, your programming, and really begin to influence them. So in this particular example, what you're looking at here is somebody who was tagged. I talked about those tags associated with the content. We also tag people based on the different kind of risk factors that they may have. So if they have answered in the health assessment or they've given us some data from their activity trackers that they need to maybe up their exercise because they're not getting they're not meeting the threshold, the guidelines for exercise, we would tag that person with Get Active. And then we're also marrying that up with the persona that they may fall into from the Social Determinants of Health data. And so if this person is a Get Active person, then we would also look, okay, if they're an at-risk urbanite, which that group is has lower levels of education, they've got a high percentage of not proficient English speakers, maybe probably English as second language, or a lot of immigrant population there. And so rather than, put something out for everybody, we put something really specific for the at-risk urbanites who need to work on exercise. And in that case, it might be get in shape without spending money, because this is a group that may not have a lot of disposable income to spend on exercise equipment, gym memberships, etc. So that would be something that might resonate with that population. And while it might also be applicable for Uptown Urbanites, that the money is not really the issue for them. They've got a little bit higher average salary, as I was mentioning. So I'm going to skip down just because I mentioned them, the Uptown Urbanites. What we might push to them instead that is still focused on understanding that they need to work on improving their physical activity is 8 reasons to exercise with friends. Because also keep in mind, this is the group that has lower levels of social associations on average. So if we can marry up 2 things and kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, it's how to help them get active and also address one of their social vulnerabilities of having those low social associations. And then one more, compare and contrast, the rural connections. These are people who are living really outside, not only urban, but suburban kind of city limits, probably on a bit more land, those kind of things, and maybe not have as many resources around them. It's how to do exercises anywhere with no equipment, because they may not have easy access, again, to gym memberships, or even in urban areas where you may have walking paths or greenways, that kind of thing, that may not be readily available to them. So if we were going to, give them a piece of resource that said, hey, look for trailheads in your neighborhood, that would not hit home with them because that's not where they live, so making sure you're really getting something that's relevant for them. And then we have another example here, and it's a same kind of concept, but the thing that I wanted to hit home on this one is that the great thing about Social Determinants of Health data is that it is geographically based. And so everybody who lives in the same geographic, area would have the same potential vulnerabilities. Also, just a little kind of mental bookmark back to when I was talking about the member verified data that we're collecting through the health assessment. The other thing that's really helpful about getting that member data and then attesting yes or no that this is actually a vulnerability for them is that you can marry that together to get a more comprehensive picture of who that person is. So just a quick little example. I live in an area, I said we're based in Nashville. I actually just live outside the city limits of Nashville, and we don't have a lot of good public transportation options in general in this area. And especially if you get outside of the metro Nashville area, your options really diminish. And so based on where I live, I would be tagged as someone who may have a transportation vulnerability because we don't have good options here. If you were to ask me if I suffer from a transportation vulnerability on my health assessment, I would say no. I've been very fortunate to have a job that I've been able to keep throughout COVID, switched to remote from home very easily. And I can afford to buy a car, I can afford to maintenance it and put gas in it. So even though in my area, there are people maybe in my neighborhood who do suffer from a transportation vulnerability. That's not one that I particularly suffer from. So even though, we may have that as a tag, I can tell somebody that's not actually one of my problems. And so then we have that one more piece of information about them so that we can target them more specifically. So the thing about social determinants of health information is that because it's geographically associated, before a member comes in and does anything else, gives us any other information, if they're brand new to our system and they just log into our site, we can already have something personalized for them in their view, which goes back to what I was just saying about really leveraging that moment in time when you have their attention. If you can put something in front of them immediately that captures their attention, that feels relevant to them, you're establishing with that person, this sort of unwritten contract of, I know you, I'm going to put things in front of you that are relevant, so come back here. We're a trusted source that can help you with information that you might need. And so that's the great thing about leveraging this SDoH data. And so this is another example of what you're seeing on the screen here of how we have tagged people saying, okay, these are the important things for the urban diversity. So it's a good support system is important for those at-risk urbanites, the ones that I was referencing that, a little bit lower education level, high percentage not proficient in English, how to get to the doctor without a car. These people may not have the transportation, opportunities that I do. And then in the suburban sprawl, really the one of the pieces of information we might push to those people is, relationships for lowering stress. So it's really about taking the content we have and leveraging this intelligence insights that we have to push things to them that are relevant. And I think the great thing about this, and this is probably the magical piece that we're all looking for, is the results of how did this actually affect engagement. And Erica is going to talk to you a little bit about how she evaluated that and the outcomes. So I'm going to switch that over for you, Erica. Take over.
All right, thank you. So, when you evaluate, when you train or create machine learning models, there are a number of metrics that we use at the time of training to select the best model. And of course, we felt really good about, all of the content, the member experience that we created that Catherine just reviewed. But as she mentioned, the real test of something like this comes from, that user behavior in production when you roll it out. So since our goal is to improve health outcomes via engagement with our health content, and we needed an engagement metric in order to understand, how this is really working. So the metric we chose, we're calling it a cumulative click-through rate, and we look at the number of members who ever viewed a tile on the screen during a given time frame. In this case, we're looking at about the last 3 quarters. That's our denominator. And then we, for the numerator, we're looking at the number of members who, who ever clicked on that during that time frame. So kind of a cumulative click-through rate or member level click-through rate there, the number who clicked over the number who viewed. And we evaluated that member level click-through rate in a couple of different ways. The first one you'll see in the bar chart on your left, we compared the content that we had targeted for given personas to all of the other content in our Explore section. And the targeted persona content is in the blue bars on the bar chart, and then all other content is in the gray. So you can see that the results were quite strong when we looked at the data that way. The cumulative click-through rates were 4 to 7% higher for the SDoH persona targeted content than for the rest of the content, which is a pretty huge result kind of in the world of engagement. But we weren't doing a strict A/B test here. This was just kind of a random trial as to who got the personalized content and who did not. So there could be some confounding variables at play, and we suspected that perhaps the novelty of the content might be driving some of these results. So to make sure, we weren't seeing just the result of a confounding variable, we looked at it the second way and compared the content that matched a given member's persona, and then compared the click-through rate with only other persona content, but persona content that did not match that member's persona. So that's getting a little bit more apples to apples comparison, and the results were still pretty clear. That's the bar chart you see on the right of the screen. And again, those blue bars are the matched personas, the gray is kind of the control, the unmatched persona content. And we still saw that for 4 out of the 5 personas, we were getting that improved engagement for the content that matched the persona. And that improvement ranged from 2% up to almost 10% for the urban diversity cluster. And then you can see the rural connections cluster, that second bar down, is the only persona where it looked like maybe we weren't quite hitting the mark there. Although you can see from the error bars, we also don't have quite enough data in the control group to really narrow that error bar down yet either. So it could be that maybe we just don't have enough data, but also maybe we just kind of missed the mark with that content. So that's some feedback that we've gone ahead and given to our content team so they can start reviewing, seeing which specific pieces of content weren't resonating quite as well, and they can kind of tweak and refine. But overall, we were pretty excited with these results.
Yeah, I think, Erica, that point you just made is a really important piece for those of you who are listening to this. It's not just about how you take this data, make sure you're making it information actionable, but it's important to review on a regular basis how this is working so that you can see where you're doing well and really hitting it out of the park, and you can tell you're connecting the right things to the right members. But it's also important to say, like, gosh, it does not look like we're really maybe getting quite what we need to for the rural connections. It's not bad if you miss it. What's bad is if you miss it and you don't know you miss it and you don't make a correction. So it's important for you to kind of evaluate these things after the fact and ensure that you're still moving in the right direction. You're making those connections that you're hoping to make. So that is the information that we were looking at really with engagement. And Eric, I did want to ask one question. When you're looking at these kinds of models and you're evaluating them, are there industry standards around those click-through rates and things that we're aiming for? Are you really more interested in the click-through rates relative to what you're comparing it to? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. There are industry standards for, like advertising click-through rates. There are Google Ads benchmarks, and those vary a lot by industry. For search results, it can be like 2 to 4%. For an embedded ad, it's 1%. It's tough to kind of compare that to our click-through rates, so we don't have a real strong industry standard, although we certainly are always aware of those, kind of advertising click-through rates and how they might relate to our own content click-through rates. But in general, we're just always going for continuous improvement over our baseline and seeing if we can do better than what we have historically and just trying to keep improving.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I forget sometimes when we're looking at this, if we're just looking in relation to what we're doing or if we're trying to hit some other benchmarks. And I do think what's your point there for me, but when I remember this is we're not going to reach those kind of marketing kind of click-through rates necessarily. I mean, those are lofty goals for this kind of platform. But I think keeping in mind improving over what you've got for baseline is a great way to look at that. So thank you. Thank you for responding to the question.
One thing to point out is this: since we are looking at that kind of member level click-through rate as opposed to a session level, that is going to be a little bit different from your typical AdWords as well.
That's a good point too. So when we were talking about this presentation and really being able to get some information out to the group that we think is important related to engagement, I think that's something that everybody is looking for, is how do we engage with our members better. And I think for us, we're always looking at ways to not just improve engagement, but thinking about how do you improve engagement without just throwing more money at somebody, because eventually there's a budget and there's the importance of really finding ways to intrinsically motivate people. So I was super happy when Erica's team did this work and came back with these results, and it was like, oh, that's fantastic to see, because this is something that is not an incentible or has not been something that was incented in our platform. So it was great to see those results. And what we thought would be helpful is also showing you a couple of other models and their results. So that's what I'm going to do now. We've got another model very similar to what we were talking about earlier, and it's just on a different set of data. So what we've been talking about up until now was that social determinants of health data that Erica's team curated from publicly available data sources and then did the modeling. This information here is the result of the information we gather from our members that are in the commercial population from the health assessment that they complete as part of our program. And you'll see in this one, there's actually 6 percentages that came out of this model. And something that I think is interesting, when we first did this several years back, maybe 4 or 5 years back, when the data really showed 5 naturally occurring clusters. And then a few years had passed, and so Erica took another pass at this data. We had more data at that point. We had more members, more data points. And when she redid her modeling, what came out was another persona popped out. And it was this 6th one, actually over here on the right, anxiously awake, which I thought was very interesting. I think it speaks to the need, again, to kind of not just do things one time. You need to go back and look and make sure, that you're, again, hitting the mark, making the connections that you're hoping to make. But as data comes in, especially in the data science world, the more data you have, the more accurate it can be, and not just the more data of the single data source. The more data you have and all kinds of different data sources give you that really kind of comprehensive view. So I thought it was a great point to add in here to make sure we're kind of hitting home the importance of reevaluating these things as you go along. And it also was interesting to me that Anxiously Awake was the one that popped out. We've had a very rough few years lately, pandemic and all the different things. So, that might be a little bit speaking to the fact that we've got a lot of stress in our lives, and maybe things that are keeping us awake is kind of your primary characteristic there. So a couple of other things to point out here from the busy professionals, for all the way on the left, these people you'll see are 1.6 times more likely to register for self-guided activities and track their progress. If you think about this persona, these are people who time is an issue for them, stress is a major factor in their life, and they're just in general more likely to do things that, as I referenced, are self-guided, so they can do it sort of on their own time. If you compare and contrast that with the laid back, the second one from the right, you'll see these people are 2 times more likely to have actually contacted their coach. And that indicates for this group, which for them, stress is not really an issue, time is not an issue. They tend to be laid back and kind of relaxed. Motivation and accountability tend to be a little bit of a problem for them. And so for these people, it's interesting that they are, more likely to actually contact that person to have that human accountability as part of their journey. And so that's kind of an interesting way, again, to understand who these people are, but also understand how they have behaved in the past so that we can understand what we might do to engage them more effectively in the future. And so we have a similar evaluation of the data that Erica just went over for this model too, to kind of look at the relevance of the click-through rates when we're talking about data that's tagged with their commercial persona. So Erica, take us through the slide if you don't mind.
Yep, so here we have the exact same charts we saw for the SDoH personas, but for our commercial personas instead. So the chart on the left, you're going to see the match persona content in blue compared to all of our other content across the experience in gray, or across the explore section of the experience. And again, you can see the results are good. The personalized with personas commercial content still outperforms the rest of our content, although it's not by quite as high of a margin as it was with the SDoH personas. And I think that may be because that content novelty issue affecting the results was probably not here. Most of this content has been around for about the same length of time when we rolled the personas out. But still, we wanted to look at that second comparison, make sure we're looking at it from as many angles as possible. So you can see the chart on the right, we're comparing, excuse me, the click-through rate for, excuse me, for the persona content compared only to other persona content, not the rest of our content. So, that really, just as with the SDoH personas, that comparison looked really good. For 4 out of the 5 personas, we saw that increased engagement for the matched persona content. And then again, we saw, kind of one persona that we maybe weren't hitting the mark as well. The evidence here is even a bit stronger that we're not getting those click-through rates for this match content. So this is a good sign for us that, hey, we did great with 4 of the 5 personas and this data-driven content creation, but maybe for the fresh start persona, we need to go back to the drawing board a little bit, dig into the data, see which pieces of content are driving engagement and which are not, and adjust. And as Catherine said, that's so important. So, we've taken that feedback back to our content team and we'll be adjusting for that individual persona.
And Eric, I'm going to take just a minute here before we move on. There's a question that came in, and it seems like this is a good time to answer it. The question was, when you're measuring the impact of engagement activities, do you go beyond click-through rates to changes ultimately in their health behaviors and their outcomes? Fantastic question. Thank you for submitting it. Yeah, and the answer is yes. We're certainly looking at, this is really the efficacy, particularly of these models and the content that we chose to tag. But ultimately, the intention here is that you will have people who are improving their health behaviors and achieving clinically, what we refer to as clinically significant outcomes. So we want people to lose weight. Absolutely, any pounds you lose are great. But the more, not the more weight that you lose, but when you lose a significant amount, so for weight it's determined as 5% of your total body weight or 10% of your total body weight are two thresholds there when you really begin seeing some improvements in your biometrics. We want to make sure we're kind of working on those too. So we certainly measure those things, and we are working on actually looking at those outcomes that we look at by our book of business, by these different personas, so that we can tell, I think probably that the whole story is, which maybe you're getting at there, is threading this through from the message from acquisition of a member to engaging that member, to what activities they were in, to the clinical outcomes they achieved, to the financial, impact that has. And so, yes, that is absolutely what you want to do, and that's what we're working on as well. We do those things, but not looking at them specifically by personas, but we're in the midst of working on that exactly what you're talking about now. So you do want to be looking at this holistically. We happen to be talking specifically about the impact of this particular model on engagement. So that's why we're kind of limited to this, but definitely want to make sure you're pulling those outcomes in there too. That's the ultimate goal. The other goal there is not just clinical outcomes. I think the other thing to remember is that there's a plethora of outcomes that are important to the health plan, and they are sometimes similar by different lines of business, and they are oftentimes very distinct by different lines of business. So just a quick example, when you're talking about the Medicare Advantage population, I think it's important for those people, of course, to be exercising and maintaining their weight and looking at their nutrition. But the thing that is most important from the health plan's perspective and our experience is really working on closing the gaps in care. So all those preventive exams that they need to close in order to get the STARS ratings calculations happening. We're really focusing on that. So it's not just about the clinical outcomes. You're also trying to evaluate whatever outcomes are important and related to the objectives of the particular line of business. So I just wanted to throw that one little piece in there as well. So speaking of that, the next thing we are going to talk about here is one more example, very timely. I've mentioned already COVID-19 and the pandemic and working from home. This is part of everyday conversation at this point. I think it will be for a while. So one of the things that we did that we thought was interesting to share with the group is leveraging personas to actually think about how you target vaccine hesitancy. And we're working with one of our plans particularly. They're looking at particular counties where they have low vaccination rates, or employer groups where they have low vaccination rates, and they want to target that. And we wanted to bring this up because I think it's interesting, timely. We've got some, a couple of results that Eric is going to go over with you. But I think this also gives us an opportunity to talk about how you are framing up information. So when I was speaking a little earlier about the importance of understanding personas, the average characteristics, and also the way they engage, that helps you understand what content might be appropriate for them, what programming, what resource you may connect them with. But the other piece of this, particularly when you're talking about social determinants of health, and anything else that may be sensitive. I think we could probably all agree that vaccinations and the things that are going on with pandemic, people are sensitive about this. It may be, one way or the other. And so when you're talking about things that maybe could be perceived as judgy or inflammatory, you need to be very purposeful and thoughtful about how you approach that. And especially when I think about social determinants of health, if you think about the example I was giving earlier where I would be tagged as somebody who may have a transportation vulnerability, but if you ask me, I don't actually have that particular vulnerability. When you're focusing on something that is geographically related, and so you don't quite know until you get that confirmation from the member if they actually suffer from that vulnerability, it's really important that you frame something up in a way that doesn't feel, again, judgy or inflammatory to them, because that will turn them off immediately, and you're really negating everything that you're trying to do by putting things in front of them that are relevant. So one of the things that we do to really, walk that path of purposefulness and thoughtfulness, we work with a behavioral economics team. They are so fantastic, so fascinating, and their whole discipline is really about how you word things, how you frame things in order to understand how people think and the way in which they make decisions, so that when you are putting something in front of them, you are more likely to make that connection. So as we've been talking about understanding the content, looking at the data to understand if we've made connections, it's important to also think about the way you're describing things, the way you're titling things, the images that you're associating with things, so that you can really make sure you're getting the most likelihood of getting that audience and not alienating them, but engaging them. So just want to put that little tidbit out there as well. And so this is one of the particular things that we've worked with that team on, is understanding how to kind of phrase these things and work through these different things that we might associate and talk about vaccine hesitancy with these different groups. So I'm going to talk again about some of the personas from the SDoH group. So at-risk urbanites and urban diversity. Again, these are two groups that may have transportation vulnerabilities, maybe a little bit more socioeconomically depressed. And so one of the things we can push to them is, how do you get a free ride to your appointment? Especially where there's a lot of things about, I think again about the Medicare population, there's subsidized ride shares through CMS, and those things have been approved, and there's things that the plans have put in place to help their members get to things. And so this truly could be like an education and awareness piece. Do you have the opportunity to get to your appointment? So that would be something that would maybe really hit home with them. Something that might hit home with the rural connections is how to have how safe the COVID-19 vaccine is. And so again, it's kind of understanding that maybe how people are thinking in that particular group, maybe the kind of communities they live in. There may be some hints there about what would be helpful for them to sort of understand and maybe get them to go get their vaccine. And then the last one, from our commercial personas, the second model we looked at, we've got two different groups here, the laid back and then the people who are in the age band of 18 to 39. If you'll recall, with the laid back persona, I was saying that was the one, time's not an issue for them, their stress is pretty low, but what they do need a little bit more of is a little bit of that motivation. And similarly with the age band of 18 to 39, they're a group that, and cast your mind back to when you were that age, you're feeling a little bit kind of invincible. You're feeling like, maybe these things are not quite applicable to you, or you're going to be fine. And so maybe the way in which you convince those people to take some action is by thinking about how getting the vaccine can help their family. I think that's a big piece of this as well. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the framing up, and then how you might actually push those things out to members. And then Erica's got a couple of results we're going to go over, and then we'll leave a few minutes for questions. All right,
yeah,
Erica.
Thanks. Yep. So as Catherine said, our content team and that behavioral economy team did a fantastic job of targeting, not just the content that Catherine showed, that was a great example, but a number of pieces of other content towards these various personas to address vaccine hesitancy. So we wanted to go ahead and show the results here. The sample sizes are quite a bit smaller than with our other results because this was rolled out quite a bit more recently, but we wanted to go ahead and share these extremely preliminary results. So because of the smaller sample size, for the first chart on the left, I rolled up all the personas together to get a little more, statistical power behind it. And so looking at the cumulative click-through rate specifically for the COVID-19 vaccination content, if we look at the content that we targeted towards this specific persona versus the more general content, and we see that we are getting, it looks like a slightly higher click-through rate for that personalized content, although you can also see from the uncertainty bars, we're not quite at statistical significance yet, but it looks like the results are promising. And then when we break that down by personas on the chart on the right, you can see again, very early results, very, very large uncertainty bars, quite a bit of uncertainty remaining still here, but some initial results coming through. It looks like, for the slide so small I can't see it, for the rural connections persona, we are starting to see some results there, maybe getting some higher click-through rates with the content that we've targeted for them. Whereas for that suburban sprawl persona, maybe we're just about breaking even there. But more data still to come, and hopefully we'll learn more, as the data comes in. But we wanted to go ahead and share because this is, of course, such a timely issue. So that was our last results slide, and I think hopefully you can see across all of the production results that we've seen that overall the data really provides strong evidence that this hybrid approach of personas, along with working with the content team and doing that data-driven personalization is really, it looks effective for improving engagement. So we were very happy to see that.
Erica, that is, thank you for that. And that last little bit you were just saying, I think speaks to one of the questions that we had, which is, it's difficult to move the needle on this kind of engagement. And it was asking, why do you think this particular approach was successful? And I think you kind of just stated that. It was that hybrid approach. is there anything else you would add to what you were just saying to fully answer that question?
No, I mean, we were really honestly kind of surprised at how amazingly impactful this was. I think it was the hybrid approach, and we're going to, continue to do more monitoring and see how the results are looking. But yeah.
Yeah, we were super happy with this. It was great. And again, anything we can do to increase engagement without throwing more dollars at it, incentives, that's always a good thing. So actually, the questions are for you, Erica, so I'm going to present them to you. One of the questions was, and actually the other two are kind of tied together, how often should persona models be evaluated to keep up with business needs? And this might be driven off of that one where we were talking about how you redid it and another persona kind of popped out of that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it kind of depends on your data source for the persona. So with our health assessment data, that tends to be kind of a yearly thing. So we've, chosen to look at that maybe around on a yearly interval. The same with the SDoH data that comes out. Most of those publicly available data sources are published every year. So we reevaluate those, around every year, maybe a couple of the years if the data is looking pretty stable. But for other use cases with other data sources that might be a little bit more dynamic, changing a bit more often, you may want to evaluate, more frequently.
So basically,
great question.
Depending on the business need and the speed at which the data changes, that kind of dictates how often you should update those things. Awesome.
Yep.
Well,
and what you're monitoring. Sorry, I say also, what your monitoring is saying. So as we're looking at these results, if we see something very off, then that would be a sign to, kind of immediately go back in and reevaluate.
Good point. So kind of related to that, do you see a lot of changes in the way members move between personas in general or year over year? Have y'all looked at that?
We have, and we see, I can't remember the exact number. I want to say it was around 10% of personas or members are shifting their persona year over year, which, makes sense. We do see changes in health assessment data year over year. People move. So yeah, I believe that was around what we were seeing, but they're overall relatively stable, which I think is a good sign.
Yeah, that is a good sign. And I think it also speaks to when you were saying before, how frequently you need to update them. If there's not, knowing that there's not a ton of change year over year, that can also maybe go into your model. But if you ran a model potentially that had a lot of change and a lot of shifting around between personas, that might also, I would imagine, dictate how often you update that model too. Is that accurate? Am I thinking along the right lines there?
Yeah, absolutely.
We did have one more question come in. If you've got a chance to, or we've got a few more minutes to answer it. They were asking if the members know what persona they are in, and if so, can the member adjust that if they don't feel like the content matches their persona? I know this answer, and since you've talked a bunch, I'll take it. So this is something that is a back-end process for us. Members do not know if they're urban Uptown Urbanites or if they're rural connections. That's not something that's visible to them. It's just something that can help us produce things for the members that are what we think is relevant. As far as the member, if they don't feel like that content matches them, and Erica, I'm going to take a stab at this, but you clarify my answer if needed. I think what would happen there is that we would actually see that mismatch in the results, as you were seeing Erica say on a couple of her results slides. So, we saw in each one of the models, SDoH and commercial, that looked like they were doing pretty good on all of them except for one. And so that to me is where you'd find out if you're not kind of making that connection. But it's not something the member can explicitly say, I'd like to be in this persona. I think they will end up giving us that information inexplicably through what they are dismissing, clicking on, etc. So, Erica, anything you'd add to that response or clarify?
I think you pretty much got it. We're always trying to take a look at when we've missed the mark and improve our models. And like you said, members can dismiss content that isn't interesting to them, isn't relevant to them, and then other content that should be more well matched will filter up. So it's definitely a back and forth kind of learning experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and Lisa, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We are at time.
Thank you so much to our speakers for that great presentation and for sharing your thoughts. And thank you to the audience for participating in today's webinar. This concludes today's presentation, and we thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.